Hey guys, welcome back. Tisha here, back for another chapter reading. We are reading John Krakauer's Under the Banner of Heaven, a story of violent faith. Go ahead and do me a favor as we jump into chapter 10, which is called Nauvoo. Hope I'm pronouncing it right. Nauvoo. If our theory of revelation value were to affirm that any book to possess it must have been composed automatically or not by the free caprice of the writer, or that it must exhibit no scientific and historic errors and express no local or personal passions, the Bible would probably fare ill at our hands. But if, on the other hand, our theory should allow that a book may well be a revelation in spite of errors and passions and deliberate human composition, if only it be a true record of the inner experience of great-souled persons wrestling with their fate, then the verdict would be much more favorable. This is William James, The Varieties of Religious Experience. Laid out across a limestone flat beside the mud-brown flow of the Mississippi River, Nauvoo is a small, tidy town with little on its surface to distinguish it from hundreds of other small, tidy towns that freckle the American heartland. A month after breaking out of jail in Missouri, however, Joseph Smith surveyed the shore along the majestic bend in the river and resolved that the kingdom of God's capital city would be erected precisely here in Hancock County, Illinois. A low-lying promontory on the river's east bend, the site was a patch of marl swamp, so wet, as Joseph himself described it, that it was with the utmost difficulty that a footman could get through it, and totally impossible for ox teams. But the place had a couple of mitigating attributes. It was all but uninhabited, and the owner was willing to sell acreage to the saints on credit. A deal was struck. Construction commenced with characteristic Mormon industrionists, y'all. INDUSTROUSNESS. And within 5 years, more than 15,000 of the Lord's elect were living in and around Nauvoo, 10 times its current population, making it the second largest municipality in Illinois. From nothing, the Saints created a city that rivaled Chicago. Unlike Chicago, moreover, Nauvoo was no mere city. It was a theatric principality, with Joseph at its head, possessing sovereign rights and powers unique not only in Illinois, but in the entire nation. These special rights were granted in a highly unusual character passed without fanfare by the Illinois General Assembly in December 1840, a time when the state was eager to attract hardworking settlers who would contribute to the economy, and sympathy for the Mormons was running high because of their expulsions from Missouri. As an unintended consequence, Illinois set Joseph up as a de facto emperor of his own autonomous city-state. He had himself officially anointed king, priest, and ruler over Israel on earth. He commanded a well-armed and rigorously disciplined militia, the Nauvoo Legion, which boasted nearly half as many men as the entire American army at the time. And then, eager for still more military power, he petitioned the U.S. Congress for authorization to establish a 100,000-man fighting force under his personal control. What? Congress thought better of granting this latter request, but Joseph was on a roll nevertheless, which probably came as no surprise to the prophet because he believed that his was the Lord's one true church and he was being guided by the hand of God. Secure in his knowledge and eager to extend his influence to the whole country, in January 1844, Joseph announced his candidacy for President of the United States. Although historians are in unanimous agreement that Joseph had a snowball's chance in hell of winning in the November election, As the Jacksonian scholar Robert Remney phrased it, it is not clear whether Joseph himself shared this view. Already, after all he'd accomplished, much more than anyone could have imagined when he'd incorporated his peculiar new church in Palmyra 14 years earlier, Joseph took the presidential campaign quite seriously in any case, dispatching 586 of his most capable and persuasive missionaries, including 10 members of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, to all 26 states and Wisconsin Territory in order to drum up support for his run at the nation's highest office. An argument can be made that Joseph ran for president because he had come to believe that it was the only way his saints were ever going to gain state protection from the terrible persecutions they had been subjected to wherever they had attempted to live. Having tried repeatedly and failed on each occasion to persuade elected officials that the government had both a moral and legal obligation to protect the Mormons from the violent mobs that wanted to eradicate them, Joseph may had decided his only recourse was to occupy the White House himself. Joseph came to the U.S. Constitution as a divinely inspired document. For years, he had complained that the political leaders were disregarding their sworn duty to safeguard the Mormons' constitutionally granted freedom to worship without being subjected to harassment, and worse, at the hands of the religious majority. Yet, in both word and deed, Joseph repeatedly demonstrated that he himself had little respect for the religious views of non-Mormons and was unlikely to respect the constitutional rights of other faiths if he somehow won the presidency and were running the show. Interesting how it's always about what's convenient, for whoever's running at the time. And sometimes you may act as if you really, really care about this thing, and then when you get in office, that thing no longer matters. I'm not trying to talk politics, but I'm just saying that's what I notice a lot of times. Not even just when it comes to politics, but even sometimes when it comes to how people do a job. The Mormons did not transform Nauvoo into a bustling hub of enterprise and godliness without first enduring serious setbacks. In 1839 and 1840, before the swamps were drained, epidemics of malaria and cholera, cholera, swept through the settlement, killing hundreds of saints, including the prophet's own father and one of his brothers. And the Missouri hostilities continued to plague Joseph and his followers long after they had been driven from the state. Although Joseph had managed to escape from jail, criminal charges against him were still pending in Missouri. Considered a fugitive from justice, he was under constant threat of being extradited to stand trial. There was a bounty on his head. Sheriffs from Missouri came to Illinois on at least 2 occasions, bearing writs for Joseph's arrest. In May 1841, a sheriff posse managed to surprise the prophet outside of Nauvoo, arrested him, and had almost hauled him across the border into Missouri before Joseph managed to finagle his release with a writ of habeas corpus. It was a very close scrape, and the harassment provoked Joseph's ire. During a public speech soon after his 1841 arrest, he vented his anger by prophesying that the retired governor of Missouri, Lilburn Boggs, the saints' despised nemesis, would die by violent hands within 1 year. What? That's like you're calling for somebody to get him. On the evening of May 6, 1842, Boggs was reading a newspaper in the study of his Independence home when a gunman, lurking outside, shot him 4 times through a window. 2 balls hit Boggs in the neck. The other 2 pierced his skull and lodged into the left lobe of his brain. Everyone assumed that he would die, and Boggs' demise was reported in the newspapers across the country. Most of the papers speculated that the assassin had been a Mormon bent on fulfilling Joseph Smith's prophecy. The handgun used to shoot the ex-governor was discovered outside Boggs' study, where it had been tossed into a puddle. An investigation quickly determined that the pistol had recently been stolen from a local store. The storekeeper told the sheriff, "I thought the N-word had taken it, but that hired man of Ward's, the one who used to work with the stallion, he came in to look at it just before it turned up missing." The hired man of Ward's was an accomplished horseman from Nauvoo named Orrin Porter Rockwell. He had arrived in Independence a couple of months earlier, then quietly slipped out of town immediately after Boggs was shot. Wow. As it turned out, the reports of Boggs' death were premature. Somehow he recovered from his severe brain injuries. The papers were right about the would-be killer, though. Rockwell was almost certainly the would-be assassin, and he was a Mormon. Afraid of nothing and fiercely devoted to the prophet, Rockwell was already becoming legendary for his willingness to spill the blood of those who had wronged the church, thereby giving them an opportunity to atone for their sins, a career that would become his life's work and inspire admiring Mormons to christen him the destroying angel and the Mormon Samson. My goodness. Although Joseph may not have ordered Rockwell to shoot Boggs, it was commonly understood by the faithful that it was a saint's sacred duty to assist in the fulfilling of prophecies when the opportunity arose. In other words, you put out that sentence. Yeah. Once Boggs' death had been foretold by the prophet, nobody needed to tell Porter Rockwell what to do. Few inhabitants of Missouri, and perhaps even fewer saints up the river of Nauvoo, doubted that the attempted assassination was the work of Mormondom's destroying angel. But neither Rockwell nor any other saint was ever brought to justice for the deed. Life in Nauvoo, meanwhile, continued apace. The city of the saints was booming. There on the banks of the great American River, the Mormons seemed to have at least found a secure foothold from which to spread Joseph's religion far and wide. He and his followers had come an impressively long way in the 17 years since Moroni had entrusted Joseph with the golden plates. I can't remember if it's Moroni, that angel. And new converts to the Mormon church were arriving to Nauvoo in even greater throngs, many now coming from as far as England and Scandinavia. The Second Great Awakening had been crawling with impassioned, silver-tongued prophets who roamed the land hawking upstart creeds. Almost all these novel faiths provided reassuring answers to the mysteries of life and death, and promised converts that they would be rewarded for their devotion by spreading the hereafter on Easy Street. But almost none of the new churches managed to establish an enduring body of followers. Most are now long forgotten. So why did Joseph's new religion triumph when so many of his competitors vanished with scarcely a trace? To be sure, there were numerous reasons why so many people found Mormonism so appealing. Probably none, however, was more salient than the colossal force of Joseph's personality. Charisma is a quality that's hard to define and even harder to explain, but Joseph was flush with it. The term is derived from the Greek charis, K-H-A-R-I-S, meaning grace or a special gift of God, and the Latin word charismus, defined as gift of the Holy Spirit. Did I say that right? Charism? I don't think I said that right. C-H-A-R-I-S-M-S. Its meaning has evolved through the centuries and is now seldom associated with sanctity, but Joseph's brand of charisma seems to have been true to the original definition. He was imbued with that exceedingly rare magnetism possessed by history's most celebrated religious leaders, an extraordinary spiritual power that always seemed to be wrapped in both great mystery and great danger. More than a century and a half after his death, Joseph's personal incandescence, Indescence. Alexa, how do you pronounce Incandescence? Incandescence has lost a little of its intensity. One can still see it blazing in the eyes of his saints. In any religion, there is a tendency for the devout to go to their founding prophet as an idealized deity, obscuring and protecting him behind an impenetrable armor of myth. Mormons are certainly no different from the faithful of the other sects in this regard, and they have done their best to airbrush every blemish from the portraits of Joseph they display to the world. But unlike Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, and Buddha, Joseph was a modern prophet who lived in the brightly lit age of the printing press. Because many who felt the pull of his immense charm left a written record of their observations, his imperfect humanity has not been so readily erased from the historical record. The fact that he remains accessible to us as a real person, warts and all, makes it easier to feel empathy for Joseph. I didn't know he had warts and sympathy. It also allows fascinating insights into what makes a religious genius tick. According to Fawn Brodie, Joseph's biographer, the prophet had an arresting physical presence. He was big, powerful, and by ordinary standards, very handsome, except for his nose, which was prominent. His large blue eyes were fringed by fantastically long lashes, which made his gaze seem veiled and slightly mysterious. When he was speaking with intense feeling, the blood drained from his face, leaving a frightening, almost luminous pallor. He was no ordinary man. When Joseph addressed a crowd, he had a knack for making each individual feel as though he or she were being spoken to personally by the prophet. He seemed to sense each saint's spiritual needs, the entire congregation's innermost hopes and pains and hungers, and then deliver a sermon that resonated in perfect pitch with every person's private longing. Here is how Juanita Leavitt Brooks, an eminent Mormon historian, described the first time a convert named John D. Lee heard the prophet preach in Missouri in 1838. Lee had come prepared to be impressed by the reality exceeded his expectations. Excuse me. He thought Joseph Smith carried an air of majesty that made him seem taller than his 6 feet as he faced the audience, and more handsome and commanding than an ordinary man, attracting every eye and holding every heart by the sheer magnetism of his personality. He played upon the congregation as though it were a musical instrument, responsive to his slightest touch. Fawn Brodie was struck by accounts of Joseph's magnificent self-assurance. Increased success had served to intensify his boldness and exuberance. The zest for living that he radiated never failed to inspire his own people with a sense of the richness of life. They followed him slavishly and devoutly, if only to warm themselves in the glow of his presence. They built for him, preached for him, and made unbelievable sacrifices to carry out his orders, not only because they were convinced that he was God's prophet, but also because they loved him as a man. They were as elated when he won a wrestling match as they were awed when he dictated a new revelation. They retold tales of his generosity and tenderness, marveling that he fed so many of the poor in Nauvoo. At his table without stint, and that he entertained friend and enemy alike. He was a gentle host, warm-hearted, friendly to all comers, and fiercely loyal to his friends. I don't know if I said that right. Genial, gentle or gentle host. Footnote says Lee would become infamous in 1857 after the Saints had emerged to Utah for his role in the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Arguing that the popularity of the Mormon church was primarily a function of Joseph's singular charisma. Brody insists that the Book of Mormon lives today because of the prophet, not because of the book. Perhaps the allure of new theology he introduced should not be discounted. Joseph inspired reworking of traditional Christians' narrative had much to do with his religion's rapid growth. To believers, of course, Mormon doctrine is the incontrovertible word of God. That excuse me, that word was nevertheless delivered via a human instrument. I keep having that choky feeling. Joseph Smith, who possessed uncanny theological instincts. Mormonism appeared in the right place at the right time to exploit a ripe niche that had opened in the nation's ever-shifting spiritual ecology. Many Americans were dissatisfied with the calcified religions of the old world. Joseph preached a fresh message that was exactly what a great number of people were eager to hear. He took measure of the public's collective yearning and intrusively shaped his ideas to fit the precise dimensions of that desire. It just goes to show you how, I don't want to call him cunning, but how calculating he was, because he knew his charm attracted people. And with people like that, that's dangerous. I wonder if somebody who was not charismatic would have been able to pull this off. Joseph had convincing answers to the thorniest, essential questions, answers that were both explicit and comforting. He offered a crystal clear notion of right and wrong, an unambiguous definition of good and evil, and although his perspective was absolutist and unyielding, it presented a kinder, gentler alternative to Calvinism, which had been the ecclesiastical status quo in the early years of the American Republic. Calvinists taught that mankind was by nature evil and was watched over by a wrathful God bent on making humans atone for Adam's original sin. They warned that the fires of hell were real. Suffering, they preached, was good for you. In Joseph's more optimistic cosmology, God's chosen people, the Mormons, were inherently virtuous, surrounded by wickedness, and didn't need to atone for anything. Making money was a righteous pursuit. The Lord smiled on the rich as well as those who aspired to become rich, and anyone who elected to obey church authorities, receive the testimony of Jesus, and follow a few simple rules could work his way up the ladder until, in the afterlife, he became a full-fledged God, the ruler of his very own world. Joseph was no hair shirt prophet, Fawn Brody observed. He believed in the good life, with a moderate self-indulgence in food and drink, occasional sport, and good entertainment, and that he succeeded in enjoying himself to the hilt, detracted not at all from the semi-defecation with which his own people enshrouded him. Any protest of impropriety dissolved before his personal charm. Man is so that he might have joy had been one of his first significant pronouncements in the Book of Mormon, and from that belief he had never deviated. He was gregarious, expansive, and genuinely fond of people, and it is no accident that his theology, in the end, discarded all traces of Calvinism and became an ingenious blend of supernaturalism and materialism, which promised in heaven a continuation of all earthly pleasures, work, wealth, sex, and power. Joseph's budding religion was both a reflection of the era's Jacksonian ideals and a reactionary retreat from them. On one hand, Joseph was a champion of the common man and a thorn in the side of the ruling elite. But on the other hand, he was deeply suspicious of the confusing babble of ideas sweeping the country and was made nervous by the fickleness of democratic governance. His church was an attempt to erect a wall against modernity's abundance of freedom, its unbridled celebration of the individual. Mormonism Mormonism strictures, 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 and soothing assurances, its veneration of order beckoned as a refuge from the complexity and manifold uncertainties of 19th century America. Joseph's fresh take on Christianity excited his followers. Converts were energized by his groundbreaking doctrines, and the innovations didn't stop. Mormons could watch their church taking form before their very eyes in all sorts of novel and fantastic ways. By the mid 1840s, when Nauvoo was in flower, Joseph had received 133 divine commandments that were weighty enough to be recorded for eternity in the Doctrine and Covenants, reflecting a significant evolution in Mormon theology in several important regards. The religion practiced in Nauvoo was quite different from the religion practiced in Palmyra when the church was initially incorporated. And none of these changes had greater repercussions than the commandment Joseph recorded on July 12, 1843. It's in the DC as section 132, which nearly shattered the church, brought about Joseph's death at the hands of a lynch mob, and has been reverberating through American society ever since. It was in DC 132 that God revealed that the new and everlasting covenant of plural marriage, a custom more commonly known to non-Mormons as polygamy. Let's go ahead and do chapter 11, the principle. It was in Kirtland that Joseph began to tamper delicately with one of the most basic mores in Occidental society. He looked upon that society with singular detachment that can come only to a man satisfied with his own ultimate authority and possessed by a longing to remold the world closer to his heart's desire. Nothing was so sacred that it could not be recast into a new utility or a new beauty. Monogamy seemed to him, as it has seemed to many men who have not ceased to love their wives, but who have grown weary of concubinal exclusiveness and intolerably circumscribed, way of life. Whenever I see a pretty woman, he once said to a friend, I have to pray for grace. But Joseph was no careless libertarian who could be content with clandestine mistresses. There was too much of the Puritan in him, and he could not resist until he had redefined the nature of sin and erected a theology edifice to support his new theories on marriage. Fawn Brody, no man knows my history. In early 1980s, when Dan Lafferty came across a copy of The Peacemaker in the library of Brigham Young University, he quickly became convinced that it had been written by Joseph Smith using the pen name of Yundi Hay Jacob. The booklet had been printed in Nauvoo in 1842 by the Prophet's own press, but Dan Lafferty is probably wrong about its authorship. Hay Jacob was no nom de plume. He actually existed. And most scholars believe that Jacob, not Smith, wrote The Peacemaker. But most of those same scholars as acknowledge that the treatise would never have been published by the church printing office with Joseph's name on the title page had the prophet not wholly endorsed it. If he wasn't the author of The Peacemaker, Joseph was almost certainly responsible for the booklet's conception and publication. Joseph had been considering polygamy and its place, at least since the church was founded, but he was reluctant to broach this delicate subject with his saints, lest they recoil in shock. By the time the Mormons were established in Nauvoo, he thought they might finally be ready to receive the principle, and he seems to have published The Peacemaker as a trial balloon. According to John D. Lee, who was living in Nauvoo when the booklet appeared, Joseph the prophet set a man by the name of Sidney Hay Jacobs sick to select from the Old Bible such scriptures as pertain to polygamy or celestial marriage, and to write it in a pamphlet form and to advocate that doctrine. This he did as a feeler among the people to pave the way for celestial marriage. Unfortunately, the feeler did not produce the desired response. The peacemaker created an uproar, prompting Joseph to claim that it had been published without my knowledge, adding, "Had I been appraised of it, I should not have printed it." The outcry over the booklet forced the prophet to issue strong public denunciations of polygamy, which was awkward because he had in fact been secretly engaging in spiritual rivalry at least since 1833, and there's compelling circumstantial evidence that he began the practice even earlier. So you're lying, you already have a wife and then another wife, but you're telling these people you didn't, sign off on this when you did. One of the first women rumored to have been intimate with Joseph outside his marriage to Emma was Miranda Nancy Johnson, who he met 1831, shortly after the Saints moved from Palmyra to Kirkland, Ohio. Miranda's mom, who suffered from chronic rheumatism, had paralyzed one of her arms, was among the crowds of curious Ohioans who came to see Mormon prophet with their own eyes. Accompanying the ailing woman was her husband, Benjamin, and a skeptical Methodist preacher who demanded of Joseph, "Here is Mrs. Johnson with a lame arm. God has given any power to men now on earth to cure her?" Taking hold of Mrs. Johnson's incapacitated hand, Joseph declared, "Woman, in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, I command thee to be whole." According to credible witnesses, Mrs. Johnson at once lifted her arm up with ease. Both Mr. and Mrs. Johnson were so moved by this miracle that they converted on the spot to Mormonism and invited the prophet to meet their 15 children, including 15-year-old Miranda. When she learned that her parents had come under the sway of Joseph Smith, Miranda later told a journalist she initially felt indignant and shame that they had been duped by such a ridiculous fake, but that was before she met Joseph for herself and was exposed to the direct radiance of his charm. Later, upon encountering him for the first time, she reported the prophet looked her full in the eye. With the greatest feeling of shame ever experienced, she felt her soul laid bare before this man as she realized her thoughts concerning him. He smiled, and her anger melted as snow before the sunshine. She knew he was what he claimed to be and never doubted him thereafter. In the summer of 1831, the Johnson family took Joseph and Emma Smith into their home as boarders, and soon thereafter the prophet purportedly bedded young Miranda. Unfortunately, the liaison apparently did not go unnoticed, and a gang of indigent Ohioans, included a number of Mormons, resolved to castrate Joseph so that he would be disinclined to commit such acts of depravity in the future. Wow. According to Luke Johnson, Miranda's older brother, on March 24th, 1832, a mob of 40 or 50 came to the Johnson house, forced their way into Joseph's room. In the middle of the night, the Carnet Mason dragged Joseph out of bed by the hair of the head. He was then seized by as many as could get hold of him and taken about 40 rods from the house, stretched on a board, and tantalized in the most insulting and brutal manner. They tore off the nightclothes that he had on for the purpose of emasculating him, and had Dr. Denson there to perform the operation. But when the doctor saw the prophet stripped and stretched on the plank, his heart failed him and he refused to operate. Having lost the nerve to follow through with their castration plans, the mob severely beat Joseph, covered his naked body with tar, plastered him with feathers from a down pillow, and then abandoned him in the woods. Despite this harrowingly close call, Joseph remained perpetually and hopelessly smitten by the female member of his flock. Among them was a noble resident of Kirtland named Fanny Alger, who was introduced to Joseph in 1830 after her parents became some of the earliest converts to the church. By the winter of 1833, when Fanny was 16, she had moved into Smith's household as a domestic servant and had grown very close to both Smiths, particularly Emma. Okay, how old did I say she was? She was 16, another young girl. According to a Mormon named Anna Eliza Webb Young, Fanny was a very pretty, pleasing young girl, and Mrs. Smith was extremely fond of her. No own mother could be more devoted, and their affection for each other was a constant object of remark. So absorbing and genuine did it seem. Joseph, however, was also extremely fond of young Fanny, and he took her as his plural wife in February or March of 1833. She may well have been the second woman after Emma, who he formerly married. He tried to keep the relationship secret, but Emma eventually discovered Joseph and Fanny flagrant delicto, and by the fall of 1835 had thrown the girl out of her house. So he did it behind her back. Neither Emma's tears nor her rage were enough to make Joseph monogamous. However, nor were the prevailing mores of the day. He kept falling rapturously in love with women not his wife. And because the rapture was so wholly consuming and felt so good, it struck him as impossible that God might possibly frown on such a thing. It's just that you enjoying, sticking your appendage in various things. Like, I'm going to call this what it is. It just so happens that all these girls are young and pretty that he's doing this to, and that he's doing it behind his wife's back, but he thinks that the Lord will want him to do that behind his wife's back. Like, make it make sense. Joseph wasn't by nature reflective or deliberate. He conducted his life impulsively, acting according to instinct and emotion. The Lord, it seemed to him, must surely have intended man to know the love of more than one wife, or he wouldn't have made the prospect so enticing. So then why isn't it in reverse for women? Why wouldn't the Lord make it so that women can have more than one husband if that's the case? Because men are so enticing. I mean, look, they come in all shapes and sizes. Some of them have abs, like, there's a lot that you can enjoy looking at on a man. So why wouldn't we say that? Okay, in the Old Testament, moreover, Joseph found ample proof that this was indeed God's intent, wherein the polygamous custom of Abraham and Jacob, the patriarchs from whom the Mormons were directly descended, were recounted with reproach or shame. That's not really a good example, especially because they did things that they were not supposed to when it came to those women, but we'll keep going. Joseph continued to take plural wives throughout the 1830s in Ohio and Missouri, and he married with even greater frequency in Nauvoo in the early 1840s, but he did whatever was necessary, including bald-faced lying to conceal his polygamous behavior, not only from censorious non-Mormons, but from all but a select few of his own followers as well. As the prophet explained to his innermost circle in 1832, he had inquired of the Lord concerning the principle of plurality of wives, and he received for answers that the principle of taking more than one wife is a true principle, but the time had not yet come for it to be practiced. More correctly, the time had not yet come for the practice to be made public. So Joseph kept the fact of his multiple wives a secret, and bided his time until the proper moment for revealing the sacred principle arrived. He did not have similar qualms about revealing other divine commandments, however. In Nauvoo, the prophet entered a phase of fervish doctrine creativity, resulting in the church's most innovative theological developments. During this period, for instance, Joseph revealed the principle of vicarious baptisms for the dead, whereby living saints could be baptized in proxy for deceased ancestors. We saw this happen in Big Love, where Barb stood in place for Marjean's mother after she passed. So it's interesting in hearing that here. Giving departed generations an opportunity to experience the salvation through the one true church, even if the departed had passed away long before Joseph introduced Mormonism to the world. It was also in Nauvoo that he introduced the elaborate rituals of the temple endowment ceremony and revealed not only that God had once been a man, but even more astonishing, that every man has the capacity to become a god. And then on July 12th, 1843, he formally codified the divine commandment revealing the sacred importance of plural marriage. Unlike the other revelations of this period, it was kept secret and wasn't acknowledged until 1852, a full 8 years after the prophet's death. The burst of theological inspiration coincided with an extended eruption of libidinous energy. I butchered that. Libidinous. Between 1840 and 1844, God instructed the prophet to marry some 40 women. Most were shocked and revolted when Joseph revealed that what the Lord had in mind for them. Several were still pubescent girls, such as 14-year-old Helen Mar Kimball, although she acquiesced when the prophet explained that God had commanded her to become his plural wife and that she would be permitted 24 hours to comply. Helen later confided to a friend, "I was young, and they deceived me by saying the salvation of our whole family depended on it." Joseph married Helen Mar Kimball in Nauvoo in May 1843. Earlier that same month, young Lucy Walker was also wed to the prophet after being similarly coerced. Her father had been among those shot during the Haun's Mill massacre, although he was one of the lucky few who managed to survive the carnage inside the blacksmith shop. In January 1842, Lucy's mother died of malaria, a plague that was rife in Nauvoo swamps. Joseph responded to this tragedy by sending Lucy's grief-stricken father on a 2-year mission. What? To the eastern states to heal his broken heart. In the father's absence, the prophet then adopted Lucy and most of her siblings. So you adopted her and then you married her? Wait, am I reading this right? Did I read that right? Yes, I did. According to Lucy's autobiography, while she was living in the prophet's home, President Joseph Smith sought an interview with me, and I said, "I have a message for you. I have been commanded of God to take another wife, and you are the woman." My astonishment knew no bounds. When the horrified girl balked at his proposal, Joseph explained to Lucy that if she refused, she would face eternal damnation. This is how they get them. "I have no flattering words to offer," he said. "It is a command of God to you. I will give you until tomorrow to decide this matter. If you reject this message, the gate will be closed forever against you." Lucy reacted with both anger and despair. This aroused every drop of scotch in my veins. For a few moments, I stood fearless before him. I looked him in the eye. I felt at this moment that I was called to place myself upon the altar as a living sacrifice. This was too much. The thought was unbearable. Courageously, she replied to the prophet that unless she personally received a revelation straight from God that he wanted her to wed the prophet, she wouldn't do it. At which point she wrote, Joseph stood before her with the most beautiful expression of countenance and said, "God Almighty bless you. You shall have a manifestation of the will of God concerning you, a testimony that you can never deny." According to Lucy's memoirs, it was near dawn, after another sleepless night, when my room was lit up by a heavenly influence. To me, it was in comparison like the brilliant sun bursting through the darkest cloud. My soul was filled with a calm, sweet peace that I never knew. Supreme happiness took possession of me, and I received a powerful and irresistible testimony of the truth of plural marriage, which has been like an anchor to the soul through all the trials of life. I felt that I must go out into the morning air and gave vent to joy and gratitude that filled my soul. As I descended the stairs, pressed, Smith opened the door below, took me by the hand and said, "Thank God you have had the testimony. I too have prayed." He led me to a chair, placed his hands upon my head, and blessed me with every blessing my heart could possibly desire. It's so sad the way that these people are brainwashed. I'm not saying that something didn't happen to her, because obviously something did, but I wonder what part he played in that. Lucy Walker was married to the prophet on May 1st, 1843, a day after turning 17. It beggars the imagination to consider how Joseph managed to maintain relationships with 40 spouses. Not even this profusion of wives, however, managed to sate his appetite. According to Sarah Pratt, the wife of Mormon apostle Orson Pratt, the prophet Joseph used to frequent houses of ill fame. Mrs. White, a very pretty and attractive woman, once confessed to me that she made a business of it to be hospitable to the captains of the Mississippi steamboats. She told me that Joseph had made her acquaintance very soon after his arrival in Nauvoo, and he had visited her dozens of times. To do what? Nauvoo was a closely woven, self-absorbed community that generated a robust flow of gossip. Try as he might, it was impossible for Joseph to conceal so much illicit activity from his followers. Time and again, public allegations would be made against the prophet, but he was extremely adept at portraying his accusers as instruments of Satan out to defame not only him, a persecuted innocent, but all of Mormondom. Joseph repeatedly managed to sweep unsavory charges under the rug before irreparable damage could be inflicted, a talent he shared, of course, with many successful religious and political leaders through the ages. Throughout this period of frenzied coupling, Joseph adamantly denied that he endorsed plural marriage, let alone engage in the practice himself. When the facts are proved, truth and innocence would prevail at last. He asserted in a speech given to the citizens of Nauvoo in May 1844, "What a thing it is for a man to be accused of committing adultery and having 7 wives, when I can find only one. I am the same man and as innocent as I was 14 years ago, and I can prove them all perjurers." He's a freaking liar left and right, and this is who they want to follow. His denials had always gotten him off the hook before, but his repeated success at wiggling out of tight situations incubated a dangerous hubris, which in turn increased his sexual recklessness. And it all caught up to him shortly after he delivered the speech quoted above in the spring of 1844. A scandal of Monica Lewinsky-like proportions exploded into Nauvoo, and this time, finally, it was too big and too hot to be extinguished by the prophet's charm. And that is where we're going to end. Let me know what you thought of those 2 chapters. We're getting a lot of background information about Joseph Smith and the things that he did. And I appreciate the fact that that's what we're getting. I'm interested in seeing what else comes of this book. Like once we get to Joseph being kaput, where are we going from there? Because we still got a lot of book left. Look, all of that was left. So we got a ways to go. Anyways, let me know what you thought of these 2 chapters. Like the video as it helps the channel. Until next time.